A billionaire CEO kicked an elderly woman's wheelchair in a crowded cafe, then slapped the quiet man protecting him. He had no idea that man was a retired Navy SEAL who had survived places most people would never hear about. But the most shocking part was not what Ethan Cole could do to him. It was what he chose not to do while his mother watched. Then the CIO's own bodyguard saw the scar on Ethan's wrist and remembered the man who once saved his life. Where are you watching from? And what would you do in Ethan's place? Like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers for more powerful stories. Ethan Cole had spent most of his adult life learning how to enter a room without being noticed. At 48, he still did it without thinking. He noticed exits before chairs, hands before smiles, and silence before danger. Tall and broad-shouldered, with short salt and pepper hair and a weathered, angular face marked by years of sun, exhaustion, and restraint, Ethan looked older than he was when he did not smile. A faint shadow of beard framed his jaw, and a long, pale scar crossed the inside of his left wrist, usually hidden beneath the cuff of his worn canvas jacket. To strangers, he looked like a quiet man who worked with his hands. To anyone trained to see more, he carried himself like someone who had spent years making certain other people got home alive. But on that warm Austin morning, Ethan was not thinking about danger. He was thinking about tea. "Slow down, Mom," he said gently as he guided the wheelchair over the small ramp outside the harbor room. Margaret Cole, 74, lifted one thin hand in mock offense. Her silver-white hair was neatly pinned behind her ears, and although the stroke 3 years earlier had weakened the left side of her body, it had not touched the sharpness in her hazel eyes. She had once been an elementary school teacher, the kind who remembered every child's birthday and could calm a crying classroom with nothing more than a lowered voice. Even now, seated beneath a soft blue cardigan with a knitted blanket over her knees, she carried a quiet dignity that made people straighten when she spoke. "I am not made of glass, Ethan," she said. "No," Ethan replied, easing the wheelchair through the doorway. "You are made of stubbornness. That came from your father. That is not what Dad used to say." Margaret smiled, and for a moment Ethan felt the knot inside his chest loosen. He had left the Navy years ago, after the phone calls from home became more frequent, and his mother began saying she was fine, in the careful way people said it when they did not want to worry anyone. He had survived missions he could never describe and places that would never appear on a map. Yet none of that had prepared him for learning how to lift his mother safely from bed, how to measure medication, or how to pretend he was not afraid every time her hand trembled around a cup. The harbor room was quiet at this hour. Sunlight poured through tall front windows, turning the polished wood tables gold. The smell of cinnamon pastries drifted from behind the counter. Ethan chose the table near the window, close to the accessible aisle, but with a clear view of the entrance and the side hallway. Old habits. He could retire from a uniform, but not from awareness. Elise Warren, the cafe manager, came over with 2 menus tucked under one arm. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with chestnut hair pulled into a loose bun and kind brown eyes that missed very little. Her father had used a wheelchair during the final years of his life, and that history had made her quietly protective of anyone who moved through the world more slowly than others. "Your usual table was waiting for you," Elise said to Margaret, "and I made sure nobody left chairs in the aisle." Margaret touched her hand. "You spoil me." "I respect you," Elise corrected with a warm smile. Ethan watched the exchange with gratitude. He did not like needing help. He disliked the feeling so much that he sometimes mistook kindness for weakness. Margaret had spent 3 years teaching him otherwise. When Elise walked away, Margaret studied her son over the rim of her teacup. "You are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Watching everyone except yourself." Ethan glanced toward the front door. "I am sitting here with you. You are sitting here physically. The rest of you is still standing guard somewhere." He looked down at his hands. Hands that had once gripped ropes, radios, weapons, and wounded men. Hands that now folded blankets, opened jars, and adjusted the footrests on her chair. "I do not know how to switch it off." Margaret's voice softened. "Maybe you do not have to. Maybe you only have to remember what you are guarding now." Ethan looked at her. Before he could answer, the cafe door opened with enough force to make a hanging bell strike twice. A man entered, as though the room had delayed its morning until he arrived. Graham Voss was 45, tall and sharply built, with dark hair combed back from a hard, clean-shaven face. He wore a charcoal suit that fit too perfectly, a silver watch that flashed under the lights, and the expression of someone who had spent too many years being obeyed before finishing a sentence. He was the billionaire CEO of Aeronix Dynamics, though Ethan did not know that yet. What Ethan saw first was not the expensive suit. It was the way the two people behind Graham adjusted their pace to his mood. One was Maya Chen, a slender 31-year-old legal assistant with straight black hair, tired eyes, and a tablet pressed tightly against her chest. She moved carefully, as if every word around Graham had to be measured before it could safely exist. The other was Daniel Mercer, a broad, powerfully built man in a dark tailored suit. Daniel's cropped brown hair, square jaw, and scanning gaze gave him the unmistakable posture of former military. He did not look relaxed. He looked contained. Graham spoke into his phone without lowering his voice. "I am not paying executives to bring me problems. Fix the language. Remove the delay and have the documents ready before noon." Maya murmured, "The review is required, Mr. Voss. The government team asked for." Graham cut her off with one glance. Ethan saw Maya fall silent. He saw Daniel's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and he felt something familiar settle into the room. The small pressure that came just before somebody decided another person mattered less. Margaret followed Ethan's gaze. "Trouble?" Ethan looked at the man in the charcoal suit as Graham strode toward the counter, ignoring Elise's polite reminder to keep the accessible aisle clear. "Not yet," Ethan said, but his hand moved quietly to the back of his mother's wheelchair, and it stayed there. Graham Voss did not notice the silence he brought into the harbor room. Men like him rarely did. They noticed delayed flights, weak handshakes, falling numbers, and people who failed to move quickly enough. But they did not notice when a barista stopped smiling, when an assistant held her breath, or when a room quietly decided it had seen enough. He crossed the café with the impatient certainty of someone accustomed to doors opening before he reached them. His charcoal suit was cut close to his athletic frame, his polished shoes striking the floor in fast, precise steps. His face was handsome in the hard, expensive way magazine covers preferred. Clean-shaven jaw, dark eyes, sharp nose, dark hair swept back without a strand out of place. But there was no warmth in him that morning. The pressure of Aronix's pending government agreement had tightened him into something brittle. Maya Chen stayed close behind him, holding a tablet against her chest. She had learned that Graham could sense uncertainty the way some people sensed smoke. At 31, Maya had already become excellent at making herself smaller in meetings without disappearing completely. Her black hair was tied low at the nape of her neck, and the faint shadows under her eyes came from weeks of legal revisions and late-night calls. She had taken the job believing Aronix would let her help build something meaningful. Instead, she had spent too many mornings translating Graham's anger into professional language for people who deserved better. "Mr. Voss," she said quietly, "the review is not a rejection. The agency legal team wants clarification around the compliance clause." Graham did not turn around, then clarify it. "They asked for documentation from 3 departments. It cannot be completed before noon." He stopped beside the counter and looked at her. Maya's voice faded. "You always have a reason," Graham said. "That is the problem with lawyers. You mistake caution for intelligence." Daniel Mercer watched from half a step behind. At 39, Daniel looked like a man built for doorways and narrow hallways, broad through the chest, heavy in the shoulders, with close-cropped brown hair and a square jaw marked by an old shaving scar. His dark suit concealed the habits of a former serviceman, the way he scanned reflections in windows, the way he kept his hands loose, the way he never stood with his back to an entrance. He had spent years telling himself that private security was simple. Protect the client. Control the environment. Do not ask questions that cost you work. But Graham had become a question he could no longer avoid. At the counter, Elise offered a careful smile. "Good morning. I just need to ask you to use the right side of the aisle, sir. We're keeping the center clear for wheelchair access." Graham glanced toward the marked path as if it had personally offended him. "I will be out in 10 minutes. "I understand," Elise said. "It is still important that the aisle stays open." He gave a thin smile. "Everything is important to somebody." Ethan heard the exchange from the window table. He said nothing, but his shoulders changed by less than an inch. Margaret noticed. Mothers noticed things that others missed. "Don't borrow trouble," she murmured. "I'm not," Ethan replied, but his eyes remained on Graham. A young boy, maybe 5 years old, darted past the pastry case toward his father near the door. Margaret, who had been reaching for her tea, instinctively rolled her chair backward to make room. At the same moment, Graham turned away from the counter, still checking a message on his phone. His shoulder struck the right armrest of Margaret's wheelchair. The impact was not violent, but the wheel slipped slightly on the polished floor. Her teacup tipped, Amber liquid ran across the table and splashed onto Graham's trouser leg. Ethan was up before the cup stopped spinning. One hand caught the wheelchair. The other steadied Margaret's shoulder. "Mom?" Margaret's fingers gripped the blanket across her knees. "I'm all right." Graham stared at the wet stain on his pant leg. For a second, Ethan expected the ordinary response. A quick apology. A question, anything human. Instead, Graham exhaled through his nose. "You should watch where you're backing up." Elise stepped forward immediately. "Sir, Mrs. Cole was in the accessible lane. You crossed into it." Margaret's face softened with embarrassment. "I'm sorry about your trousers." Ethan looked down at her. "Mama," he said gently, "you don't have to apologize." Graham finally looked at him. His eyes moved over Ethan's faded canvas jacket, work boots, and weathered face. The calculation took less than a second. No tie, no bodyguard, no visible power. "Your mother bumped into me," Graham said. "I am not interested in an argument." Ethan's voice stayed low. "She moved to avoid a child. You were looking at your phone." Maya flinched because it was true. Graham's gaze sharpened. "Are you accusing me? I'm telling you what happened." The cafe seemed to shrink around the words. Noah Grant looked up from his laptop. He was a slim young man with messy blonde-brown hair, round glasses, and the uneasy posture of someone who preferred code because code did not shout back. He had been trying to ignore the conversation, but now his fingers hovered above the keyboard. Graham stepped closer to Ethan. "Do you know how many people have opinions about my life every day?" Ethan did not move. "That does not make your opinion the only one that matters." Margaret reached for Ethan's wrist. Her fingers closed over the pale scar beneath his jacket cuff. For one suspended moment, Ethan was no longer in a warm cafe. He was somewhere else, wind against concrete, radio static in his ear, a frightened voice calling for help from behind smoke. His body remembered before his mind could stop it. Then Margaret's thumb pressed gently against his scar. Not a warning, not fear, a reminder. "You're home," she whispered. Ethan's eyes lowered to her hand. When he looked back at Graham, the coldness in his face had softened into something steadier. Graham missed all of it. He glanced down at the wheelchair. Annoyed by the obstacle, it represented more than the woman sitting in it. "This place needs better management. You can't leave these things in the middle of a walkway." The word landed harder than he seemed to expect. "These things," Elise's mouth tightened. Maya stared at the floor. Daniel's posture shifted. Not enough for most people to see. Enough for Ethan to notice. Ethan spoke carefully. "That is my mother." Graham lifted one shoulder. "Then move her." The silence that followed was almost physical. Margaret sat very still. She had spent 3 years learning how quickly a room could begin speaking around her instead of to her. People opened doors for her and then talked over her. They used soft voices that carried pity. They treated her chair as if it erased the woman inside it. But Ethan had never done that. He had asked what she wanted. He had waited for her answer. He had made room. And now Graham was asking him to do the opposite. Ethan leaned slightly closer, not threatening, not loud. "You are going to ask whether she is hurt." Graham laughed once. "Or what?" Daniel looked at Graham then, really looked at him, and something tired moved behind his eyes. Maya whispered, "Mr. Voss, please, let's leave." But Graham's face had already changed. Pride had found an audience, and pride, when frightened, always wanted someone weaker to punish. He looked down at Margaret's front wheel. Then he drew back his polished shoe. Ethan saw the movement, so did Daniel, and both men understood that the next second would change everything. Graham Voss's polished shoe moved toward the front wheel of Margaret Cole's chair, with the casual cruelty of a man who had spent too long believing consequences belonged to other people. Ethan saw it before the impact. So did Daniel Mercer. But neither man reached the wheel in time. Graham's shoe struck the metal rim with a short, ugly scrape. The chair jolted sideways. Margaret's hands tightened around the armrests, and the cup on the table slid hard enough to spill the last of its tea across the saucer. Ethan caught the chair immediately, one hand on the handle, the other steadying his mother's shoulder. "Mom," he said, low and controlled. "Look at me." Margaret's breath came shallow for a second. Her pale face had lost color, but her hazel eyes remained fixed on her son. "I'm here. You're safe." The words were quiet, yet something in them changed the air around the table. Graham leaned back, almost amused by the attention. It was a tap. "Everyone needs to stop acting like I committed a crime." Elise's face hardened behind the counter. "You kicked a wheelchair." "I nudged it," Graham corrected, as though vocabulary could clean an action. Maya Chen stood frozen beside him. Her tablet had lowered from her chest. Her fingers curled so tightly around its edge that the knuckles turned white. For years, she had watched Graham make people feel small in conference rooms, elevators, and private calls. He had always been careful enough to leave no visible bruise. Today, in a bright cafe full of witnesses, he had stopped being careful. "Mr. Voss," Maya said, her voice unsteady but audible, "please stop." Graham turned toward her with a look that would have silenced her a week ago. "What did you say?" Maya swallowed. "We should leave. Are you giving me instructions now?" "No," she said. "I'm asking you not to make this worse." Daniel's eyes moved from Graham to Ethan. He knew that silence. The former serviceman in him recognized it immediately. Not weakness, not hesitation, but restraint under pressure. Ethan's shoulders were loose, his breathing was even. His body stood between Graham and Margaret without appearing to threaten anyone. That was what made Daniel uneasy. He had seen men shout when they were afraid. He had seen men posture when they wanted control. Ethan did neither. Ethan adjusted the blanket over Margaret's knees. "You need to apologize," he said. Graham laughed. "To her? To my mother." She was in the way. A young woman at a nearby table gasped softly, then covered her mouth. Noah Grant's laptop screen had gone dark as he reached for his phone. His nervous eyes moved between Graham and Ethan, uncertainty fighting with instinct. Margaret touched Ethan's sleeve. "Please," she murmured, "let it go." Ethan looked down at her, and for a moment the cafe disappeared. He remembered a different room years earlier, hospital white walls, his mother sitting beside him after a deployment, holding a paper cup of coffee while he stared at nothing. He had told her that anger was useful because it made decisions simple. Margaret had shaken her head. "Anger only makes the first decision," she had said. "Character makes the next one." That memory returned now with the weight of a hand on his shoulder. Margaret slowly reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the red mark, beginning to form on Ethan's cheek. Not because Graham had struck him, but because Graham had leaned close enough to invade the fragile circle of safety around them. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Your father used to say that a man's strength shows most clearly when someone weaker is watching." Ethan's jaw tightened, not from rage, from recognition. He looked around the cafe and saw what Margaret meant. Elise stood still. Maya looked frightened. Noah's phone trembled in his hand. Even Daniel, built like a wall and trained to protect power, seemed to be waiting for Ethan to decide what kind of moment this would become. Ethan lowered his voice. "Mr. Voss, walk away." Graham stepped closer instead. "You think you can order me around because you have an audience?" "No," Ethan said. "I think you can still choose to leave before you embarrass yourself further." The words struck Graham harder than a shout would have. His face changed. The anger in him had always depended on people shrinking away, but Ethan did not shrink, neither did Elise. Maya had not left, Daniel had not moved to intimidate anyone, and Noah, after a long breath, lifted his phone fully and began recording. Graham noticed. "What are you filming?" Noah flinched but did not lower the phone. "What happened? You have no right, I think I do." The cafe became painfully quiet. Graham looked back at Ethan. "You're enjoying this?" "No," Ethan answered. "I'm trying to end it." But Graham had lost the ability to hear anything except the sound of his own pride cracking. He grabbed Ethan's jacket near the collar. Daniel moved at once. "Sir, don't." Graham ignored him. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Ethan's hands remained at his sides. "Let go of my jacket." "Or what?" The question hung between them. Ethan could have answered it in 100 ways. His body remembered every one of them. There were fast answers, painful answers, answers that would put Graham on the floor before anyone finished gasping. But Margaret was watching, and that mattered more than every old instinct inside him. Ethan repeated himself. "Let go." Graham's grip tightened. Then, in a sudden burst of humiliation and rage, he released Ethan's jacket and slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the harbor room. A spoon fell from a nearby table. Maya covered her mouth. Noah's camera captured everything. Ethan's head turned slightly from the blow. A red print appeared across his cheek. For one long second, nobody moved. Then Ethan faced Graham again. His voice was calm enough to frighten Daniel. "Are you finished?" Graham's breathing turned uneven. The confidence on his face had begun to fray, but he did not know how to retreat. Not with witnesses. Not after the slap. He pointed at Ethan, trying to recover his authority. "You threatened me. I asked you to leave. You're going to regret this." Ethan looked past him at Margaret. She sat upright now, afraid but composed, her hands folded over the blanket Ethan had straightened for her. "No," Ethan said, "I won't." Daniel took a slow step forward. His attention was fixed on Ethan's left wrist, where the jacket sleeve had shifted during the slap. A pale scar showed against Ethan's skin. Daniel's face changed, not recognition yet, something deeper, something frightened. He stared at the scar, then at Ethan's eyes, as if a memory from another life had just opened its door. And for the first time, Daniel Mercer did not look like Graham Voss's bodyguard. He looked like a man who had just remembered who he used to be. Daniel Mercer stared at Ethan Cole's exposed left wrist, as if the pale scar had opened a door to a place he had spent 8 years trying to forget. The cafe remained silent around them. Graham Voss stood a few feet away, still breathing hard from the slap, waiting for Ethan to break. He did not understand that Daniel was no longer watching the argument. Daniel was watching a memory. 8 years earlier, Daniel had been younger, louder, and far more certain that courage meant never admitting fear. He had been assigned to protect a medical evacuation team during an overseas crisis. When their convoy was trapped near a damaged village road, smoke had swallowed the air, radios had failed, and civilians had been caught between the danger and the only route out. Daniel remembered his own hands shaking. He remembered a senior operator kneeling beside him, a hard-faced man with a scar on his wrist, speaking in a voice calm enough to cut through panic. Breathe 4 times. Watch the people who cannot run. Then move. That man had carried a wounded medic through the chaos and returned twice for strangers Daniel had assumed would be left behind. Now that man stood in front of him wearing a faded jacket, shielding an elderly woman in a wheelchair. Daniel's voice lowered.
Senior Chief Cole?
Ethan studied him for a moment. Recognition came slowly, not because he had forgotten Daniel, but because Ethan had spent years trying not to revisit the faces attached to old missions. Mercer, Ethan said quietly. Graham looked from one man to the other, irritation tightening his mouth. What is this? Daniel did not answer him at first. He looked at Margaret. Her hands rested over the blue blanket on her lap, but her fingers still trembled. Then he looked at the red mark on Ethan's cheek. You pulled Lieutenant Alvarez out of the vehicle, Daniel said. You went back after the second blast. Ethan's expression barely shifted. Alvarez made it home? Daniel nodded once. He has a son now. For the first time since Graham entered the cafe, something softened in Ethan's eyes. It lasted only a second. Good, he said. Graham scoffed. So you two share some military story. That does not change the fact that this man threatened me. No, Daniel said, turning toward him. He did not. The words landed with unexpected force. Graham's face hardened. You work for me. I work security, Daniel replied. I do not rewrite what I saw. Maya Chen stepped forward before fear could stop her. Her face was pale, but her posture had changed. The careful legal assistant, who had spent years smoothing over Graham's anger, was still there, but she was no longer hiding behind her tablet. Mr. Voss, she said, there are cameras in this cafe. Several people recorded the incident. You should stop speaking until counsel is present. Graham stared at her. You are my counsel. I am your employee, Maya corrected, and I am telling you that you have created a serious problem. He laughed once without humor. You think a few phones can destroy me? Noah Grant raised his phone from the nearby table. His hands shook, but he kept recording. It is more than a few phones. Elise Warren came from behind the counter, holding a small security monitor tablet. The camera above the register has a clear view of the accessible aisle, she said. It recorded the collision, the kick, and the slap. Graham's gaze flickered toward the screen. For the first time, uncertainty touched his expression. Margaret lifted her head and looked directly at Graham. She had been quiet because she did not want Ethan's pain to become the center of the room. But there was still the teacher in her, the woman who had spent 30 years looking at frightened children and finding the words that made them feel seen. You know what hurts most? She asked. Graham said nothing. It is not that you hit my son. It is that you looked at me and saw an inconvenience instead of a person. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's voice remained gentle. And I think that may be the saddest thing that has happened to you. Graham's eyes narrowed, but he had no quick answer. Her words had not attacked him. They had simply named something he could not outrun. He reached for his phone. Fine, he said. I will call someone who understands reality. Daniel's shoulders tightened. Mr. Voss, don't. Graham ignored him and dialed Robert Hale, Aeronix Dynamics Vice President for Government Relations. Robert was a gray-haired former congressional liaison known for his disciplined manner and his ability to turn chaos into careful language. He was waiting at a downtown hotel for a high-level contract meeting involving Aeronix and a federal procurement team. The call connected. Graham, Robert said. We are 15 minutes from the briefing. Where are you? I am dealing with a disturbance, Graham replied. A former military man is harassing me at a cafe. Daniel is refusing to handle it. Daniel's jaw tightened. Robert's voice stayed measured. Who is the former military man? Graham looked at Ethan with contempt. Ethan Cole. Apparently he used to be some kind of SEAL. There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough for Graham to notice. Senior Chief Ethan Cole, Robert asked. Ethan did not move. Graham frowned. I suppose. Robert's tone changed. It lost all impatience. Put the phone near him. Graham laughed in disbelief. Robert, this is ridiculous. Put the phone near him. Ethan did not take the phone. He only stepped close enough for his voice to carry. Robert. Another silence came through the speaker. Ethan, Robert said. What happened? Ethan glanced at Margaret before answering. Mr. Voss entered an accessible aisle after being asked not to. He struck my mother's wheelchair, kicked the front wheel, insulted her, then slapped me. Maya closed her eyes briefly. Daniel looked down. Graham's face lost color. Robert exhaled slowly. Graham, the signing meeting is postponed. You will not attend. I am notifying the board, internal legal, and the ethics office immediately. You cannot do that, Graham snapped. I can postpone your participation pending review, Robert replied, and I am doing exactly that. This is a misunderstanding. No, Robert said. It is an incident with witnesses, video, and a serious question about judgment. The call ended. Graham stood motionless, holding the phone at his side. Outside, the first distant siren rose above the traffic. Daniel looked toward the front windows, then back at Ethan. I am sorry, he said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Tell the truth. The siren grew louder. And for Graham Voss, the room he had entered, as though it belonged to him, no longer offered anywhere to stand. The first patrol car stopped outside the harbor room, with its lights flashing silently against the cafe windows. For a moment, the red and blue reflections moved across Graham Voss's face like warnings he had ignored too long. He stood near the counter with his phone still in his hand, his charcoal suit no longer looking powerful. It looked expensive and strangely fragile. Officer Ramirez entered first. He was 52, broad through the middle, with close-cropped gray hair, a weathered brown face, and the patient eyes of a man who had spent decades separating panic from truth. His uniform was neat but not theatrical. His calm came from experience, not performance. Behind him was Officer Tessa Morgan, a younger patrol officer in her early 30s with auburn hair secured beneath her cap in a direct, observant manner. She carried herself carefully, taking in the room before speaking. Who called? Ramirez asked. Maya Chen raised her hand. I did. Graham turned sharply. You called the police on me? Maya's face tightened, but she did not step back. I called because a woman in a wheelchair was endangered and a man was assaulted. Ramirez nodded once. All right. Everyone take a breath. We're going to sort this out. He did not begin with Graham. He walked toward Margaret first. Mom, are you hurt anywhere? Margaret looked at Ethan before answering. I'm shaken. My shoulder is sore, but I don't think I need an ambulance. Ethan crouched beside her chair. The movement revealed the tenderness beneath his guarded nature. We can get checked anyway. Margaret rested a hand on his arm. In a minute, let the officer do his work. Ramirez noticed the red mark on Ethan's cheek. And you, sir? I'm fine, Ethan said. Did this man strike you? Before Ethan could answer, Graham spoke. He threatened me. My security detail can confirm it. Daniel Mercer looked at Graham, and whatever loyalty had held him there finally broke cleanly. No, Daniel said. He did not threaten you. Graham's face sharpened. Daniel. He told you to leave. He told you not to touch Mrs. Cole again. You grabbed him, then hit him. Officer Morgan wrote quickly while Ramirez turned to Noah Grant. You have a recording? Noah swallowed. The slim young developer looked uncomfortable with every pair of eyes on him, but he unlocked his phone. Yes, sir. I started before the slap. I also got him kicking the wheel. Elise stepped forward with the security tablet. Our camera has the full accessible aisle. Ramirez accepted both devices. He watched without expression. No one spoke while the footage played. Graham moving into the marked aisle, Margaret backing away, the collision, the kick, Ethan steadying the chair, Graham's hands striking Ethan's face. When the video ended, Ramirez looked at Graham. Mr. Voss, based on the footage and witness statements, you are being detained while we investigate an assault allegation and conduct involving a mobility device. Graham's mouth opened in disbelief. Do you have any idea what this will do to my company? Ramirez's gaze did not change. Right now I'm concerned about what you did to these people. Margaret lifted one trembling hand. Officer, she said softly, before you take him away, may I say something? Ramirez paused. Of course, Margaret looked at Graham. Her eyes were tired but not hateful. My son came home from war because I prayed he would remember compassion, she said. Today he did. I hope, for your sake, that you remember it too. Graham stared at her. For the first time that morning, no answer came, no insult, no demand. Just a brief, startled silence from a man who had built his life around always having the final word. Ramirez turned back to him. "Mr. Voss, please place your hands behind your back." Graham did not resist, but his shoulders sank as Officer Morgan secured the cuffs. The sound was small. It was not dramatic, yet it changed the room, not because anyone enjoyed seeing him restrained, but because the room finally had a boundary again. Maya closed her eyes and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. Daniel removed his earpiece and set it on the counter. "I'm done," he said to Graham. Graham glanced over his shoulder. "You're quitting?" Daniel nodded. "I should have left the first time I saw you hurt someone just because you could." Then Daniel faced Ethan. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Ethan studied him. "You saw it when it mattered." Daniel lowered his head once, accepting the mercy without asking for more. As the officers led Graham toward the door, cameras from phones remained lowered. No one cheered. Elise held the door open, her expression firm but quiet. Graham passed Margaret without looking directly at her. Outside, the patrol car door closed. The lights disappeared down the street a few minutes later, leaving the harbor room strangely still. Ethan turned back to his mother. "Let's get your shoulder checked." Margaret nodded. "After one thing." "What?" She looked at the abandoned tea on the table. "I would like another cup." The first one had a terrible ending. A laugh moved through the room, gentle and relieved. Ethan's mouth softened into a real smile. Elise hurried toward the counter. "Tea is on the house, and I'll bring the cinnamon biscuit you like." Margaret smiled. "Then perhaps the morning can still be saved." Later that afternoon, Ethan sat beside Margaret in an urgent care waiting room. The doctor found no fracture, only mild strain and bruising. Ethan listened to every instruction twice, asked about warning signs, then helped Margaret settle into the passenger seat of his old truck. On the drive home, neither spoke for several minutes. Austin moved past the windshield in warm strips of sunlight and traffic. Finally, Margaret said, "You were angry." "Yes, but you did not let anger drive." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "I wanted to, I know." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "For a second, I forgot where I was." Margaret reached across the console and touched his sleeve. "But then you remembered who you were." Ethan looked at her hand. "No," he said softly. "I remembered who you taught me to be." By evening, the facts had begun moving through channels Ethan could not see. Robert Hale had informed Aeronix's board that Graham would be placed on administrative leave pending review. Maya had agreed to provide records of prior complaints. Daniel had given a formal statement. Noah had sent the original video file to the investigating officer instead of posting it online. Ethan did not ask for updates. He did not want fame, revenge, or a new story attached to his name. He wanted his mother safe at home, her medication on the counter, and the quiet sound of her television drifting from the living room. A week later, the harbor room set aside their window table again. Elise had placed a small vase of yellow flowers beside it. Margaret looked at Ethan as he guided her chair into place. "Did you check the exits?" Ethan glanced around the bright, ordinary room. Then he sat across from her. "Not today," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. He smiled. "Today I'm just having tea with my mother." And for the first time in a long while, he meant it. Sometimes the miracle is not that the storm disappears. Sometimes the miracle is that God gives us the strength not to become the storm ourselves. Ethan could have answered cruelty with anger. He could have let pain make the next decision for him. But because his mother was watching, he chose patience, dignity, and love. And in that quiet choice, something greater was revealed. God can still guide a wounded heart toward mercy, even when the world gives it every reason to harden. In everyday life, we may not face a crowded cafe, a powerful bully, or a moment watched by strangers. But we all face small tests, a harsh word, an unfair accusation, a person who treats us as though we do not matter. In those moments, remember that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the courage to remain kind, to protect the vulnerable, and to trust that truth will stand when the noise fades. May God give you wisdom when you are tested, peace when your heart feels heavy, and courage to do what is right even when it is difficult. May He protect your family, guide your steps, and remind you that your quiet faithfulness is never unseen. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Tell us in the comments, when has quiet strength helped you through a difficult moment? And subscribe to the channel for more stories about faith, courage, compassion, and the power of doing what is right. May God bless you and everyone you love.